All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to just let our guests introduce themselves so you know who they are. Connie, do you want to get started?
Yeah, happy to. So good morning, everyone. We are here to give you just a bit of background in our process for next of kin interviewing and some of the related work we're doing in Milwaukee County. And we're happy to answer questions about this and related topics as we go. We are going to start with quick introductions. So I'm Connie Kostelak. I'm an assistant professor at the Medical College of Wisconsin in our Institute for Health and Humanity. And then I also lead our data division for our Comprehensive Injury Center. So I will turn it over to Victoria and Angela and Zulema to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Victoria Wright. I'm one of the social workers. All three of us are embedded at the Milwaukee County Medical Examiner's Office, and we are the social workers that do bereavement support and next of kin interviewing. So we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Okay. Hi, my name is Angela Montgomery, and as Victoria just stated, I'm one of three of the social workers embedded at the Medical Examiner's Office, reaching out to families for supportive bereavement supportive calls and next of kin interviews / I call them conversations as well.
Hello, everybody. My name is Zulema Parrilla. I am also, as Angie and Victoria stated, I'm one of the social workers embedded at the Medical Examiner's Office.
All right. So we thought what we would do is just give you a little bit of context for what overdose fatality review looks like in Milwaukee County and how the social work positions fit in, since it is all tied together in terms of how we use the next of kin interview information. So just as a little bit of history, we started the Milwaukee County team. So overdose fatality review, or OFR, started in Wisconsin in about 2016, and the Milwaukee County team developed a couple of years later and was really focused on case reviews across the entire county. And then we ended up, Milwaukee's a little bit different than some places. We have essentially the city of Milwaukee has a health department, and then we also have health departments in all the suburban jurisdictions in Milwaukee County. So those suburban jurisdictions started their own OFRs in their local communities. So we essentially had multiple going on within Milwaukee County, which, just for context, is the largest county in Wisconsin. So then we ended up adding on, we realized that part of what was happening is we were doing case reviews, but we didn't always know how those fit in the bigger picture. So we added an aggregate data team in 2021 with our first grant from the Bureau of Justice Assistance. And then the county team was really focused on City of Milwaukee overdose cases. And then in 2023, we combined those together into what we now call our Overdose Public Health and Safety Team, or ODFAST. And we have since that time had multiple iterations in terms of what things have looked like. And we'll talk in a second about when the social work positions were added in, but essentially in that first round of BJA funding, we were able to fund the 2 social work positions. Victoria had actually started a little bit earlier under some different funding, and then we received opioid settlement funds in 2024 to continue those positions and are working to continue them obviously long term. And then in 2024, we did get another BJA grant to continue and enhance the work of ODFAST, which is actually when Zulema's position was added into the team. So when we look at where this came from in terms of having the social workers even be part of the work that's happening in Milwaukee County, we had a recommendation from fairly early in the OFR process that was looking at the fact that individuals and children in particular who witness a fatal overdose or the investigation of a fatal overdose may need to be connected to additional supportive services based on the trauma that they've experienced from losing a loved one, or in some cases even encountering the actual situation when someone lost their life to an overdose. So the Milwaukee County Overdose Fatality Review Team identified that original recommendation back in 2019, and then it took a while to get that initial funding to get the positions started in September of 2021, but then obviously we've been successful now in maintaining and growing the team over the last number of years. So our initial steps in May of 2020, we had initial funding through what we call our MORI team, our Milwaukee Overdose Response Initiative, which is essentially a community paramedicine team with our Milwaukee Fire Department. They go out and do follow-up with individuals after a non-fatal overdose incident. So they help to really get this started. And then we applied with the medical examiner's office for that first round of funding through BJA through the Comprehensive Opioid Stimulant and Substance Use Program, which was named something else back then. As many of you probably know, it's gone through multiple iterations. So Victoria was originally hired in May of 2020. And then when we received the funding in 2021, that really solidified the position more and allowed us to add Angela into the mix. So by fall of 2021, we had the 2 social work positions. So they are both employed by the Medical College of Wisconsin. Originally, it was Victoria's position was actually through a community-based organization for a short period of time, and then moved over to be part of the Medical College of Wisconsin, but they are physically embedded, as they said, within the medical examiner's office, which I actually think is a really important part of both the ongoing grief and bereavement support and the next of kin interviewing and how that actually works for us in Milwaukee County. So we're going to jump into the role of the social workers a little bit more directly and talk a little bit about the outreach calls just for context, because it's hard to talk about the next of kin interviews and the way our process looks without understanding how the outreach calls actually work as well. So I think this is where I'm going to pass to Victoria to jump in, and then we're going to tag team a little bit as we go through the rest of our conversation this morning.
Thank you, Connie. So welcome everyone once again. I do want to say that I want to make this open. If you have questions, please let me know. You can start by putting it in the chat. And if there's anything you really want to know as I'm talking about it, please feel free. As the social workers that are embedded with the medical examiner's office, we work hybrid. So we're in the office a couple days per week, and then the rest of the time we spend in our home offices. For me personally, that is very important because my home office is a sunroom with a lot of windows, and as you can see, there's a record player back there. When you're dealing with death and all sorts of other things, it's always important to have music, according to me. That's my thing. So I try and balance out my day as I'm talking to families who are going through different stages of grief. The primary role of us as social workers is to reach out to anybody who's been identified as the primary next of kin, to screen for their needs and for any type of grief support they may need. So this typically happens. We have direct access to all information about decedents in Milwaukee County because we have access to their case management system, which is now called Forensic Advantage. It used to be called something else. So we have that kind of information available to us on a daily basis. We assign cases by it's every person gets at least one. So what we're looking at typically is anybody who's been identified as a probable overdose fatality. And we'll wait 6 weeks. We learned the easy way, which I'll talk about in a second, to wait between 6 to 8 weeks for that first initial contact. Because when I first started with the community-based organization and with the MORI team, the thought was, hey, call them within 72 hours. That didn't work. It wasn't actually a good idea because most people are focusing, how are we going to do a celebration of life or do whatever we need for our loved one? So they're very focused on that. The next thing they're focused on is, well, what did they die of? They're not ready to talk about the substance use. They're not ready to talk about their own needs. So we decided waiting until the 6 to 8 week mark was more important because that's when we'll typically have the confirmed cause of death, and then family can focus typically. Most of our work is done primarily telephonically. We use either the landline phones through the medical examiner's office or our grant funded cell phones. So that's there. Next of kin outreach, as I said before, we developed a protocol for us to be able to successfully reach out to families because we were trying to figure it out. I mean, this was the first year that I did the program for 1 year through the community-based organization. It was okay, social worker, we just need you to call everybody who's a probable next of kin. And at the time, it was about 700 people. It's a lot of people for one person. So we would try and reach out, and I had no idea what I wanted to say. I have several years of experience in social work, but I had never primarily reached out to people who had suffered this level of loss. So once we came over to the medical college, we did develop a very effective protocol that we use, and we work through REDCap. We have our own REDCap project where we track all suspected overdose deaths. Outreach efforts and referrals. So we set up a referral system after we met with all of these community-based organizations to see what could they offer. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those referrals look like. We screen each and every investigative report that we identify as a probable overdose for immediate need. Meaning, if let's say someone was co-using with a loved one, a friend, a stranger, if we have information about that stranger, maybe they did not particularly um, pass away from this loss, but maybe they were under the influence. Maybe it says in the report they were altered in some way. Perhaps they may be appropriate to have one of the Maury team or one of the other mobile integrated health teams, because we have a few of them depending on what city they're in, to go out to the home to see if they're interested in harm reduction services. So we may send them out immediately and say, hey, this person was there. They may need some assistance. Maybe they need grief support, if there was any housing or any other thing. The main thing we do a majority of our referrals for is actually individual therapy. We do about 70%, I'm sure it's on the later slide, of our referrals for individual therapy through one of the other offices through the city of Milwaukee, which we'll talk about later. Um, let's see, for most cases, I already said that, 6 to 8 weeks. We do a lot of grief support. We try and identify needs. We do not have our own service like program in that way. We're working with community-based organizations. So it's not that we have dedicated funds to pay for these things. We're working with agencies that are agreeing to provide support for these families, and we make referrals for that. That can be anything from we've made referrals for guardianship of children as relatives take over for a primary caregiver who may have passed away, or if they need any other information on other things in the community like housing and everything. So we try and make those referrals within those 6 to 8 weeks. And we agree to call the families back. If they say, look, this is helpful, please call me back. I would like to continue talking to you. I'm not ready for a referral. We do that. I have people, I make this joke all the time. One individual, his wife died, and one of his favorite things to do for the first 6 months was give me updates on what's going on in his life, which included getting his teeth fixed and getting on dating apps. I didn't need to know, but he wanted me to know. So he would call me once a month and say, yeah, I got my teeth fixed. Can I send you a picture? I don't need to see a picture, but I appreciate you telling me about it. And we would listen, and I would talk to him about it. And he was still in his stages of grief. And when he was ready, he took a referral for individual therapy, but he wasn't ready for quite a while. We also send out letters to anybody who's living outside of Milwaukee County. So I wanted to be clear on we can only provide information about resources in Milwaukee County. So if someone lives a little further outside of the county, I'm not sure whether you guys know all the counties in Wisconsin, so I won't go through all of them. But if they live outside of Milwaukee County, we will send them a letter that identifies what grief looks like, gives information about how they can contact us. We provide national resources that may be appropriate for them and encourage them to reach out at any time and talk to us. As was already mentioned, we added Sulema last year. I think it was last year. And because we identified speech Spanish translation was very important, and we did not have someone to fill that role. So we were able to add her last year, and we're thankful to have her as part of this team. So, all right, let's look at these metrics. So doing this works from September of 2021 through December of 2025. We make about 62% of the people that we've identified for contact, we will make an attempt to call them. So there are reasons why we don't contact a few other ones. We'll talk about that in a second. But we try and make contact with 100%, but there are specific circumstances where we cannot for various reasons. One of them, as listed here, if the next of kin won't be contacted because they live outside of the county or they live outside of the state, then we put that in our system. We've gotten a fair number of people who maybe they live in Illinois, maybe they live in Puerto Rico. We do not necessarily reach out to those individuals. We do send the letters though. And then for the cases where outreach was attempted, our aggregate number is 102%. So we get great responsiveness. People are very open to it. When I first took this job, I was told by a number of people, nobody's going to talk to you. They don't know you. Why would they talk to you when they don't know you? Well, no, I call, my teammates call, and honestly, people are very open to the contact. Very rarely do we get people saying, why are you calling me? Most of the time they're talking and they're giving us a lot of information. They're processing their grief and they're very thankful for that outreach. Where contact was made among those cases that were attempted is 78% actually answered the phone. So that's what I was speaking to. Next slide.
Sorry, I was just going to jump in for a second. I was having
Yeah,
trouble
about the
unmuting.
102.
Yeah, so part of the reason it's 102 is that sometimes we do have more than one where we will end up with attempts for the same situation. And we also have, just some timing issues in terms of what we're counting when. But ultimately, of the ones that have been identified, as Victoria said, we're going to try to reach them all. And maybe you can talk a little bit about how many attempts you typically make.
Sure.
But the fact that we're regularly getting almost 80% of people to at least answer the phone ultimately after one or more tries is way higher than I think we anticipated when we started this. And part of the reason we're giving you this background is this then ties into how we do the next of kin interviews. So in most cases, there's already been a bit of a relationship established as part of the grief support before we then do the follow-up for the next of kin interviews. And one of the things we probably should have put in here that we didn't is we've started in the last year plus actually doing a survey that we send out to individuals that have been contacted. And right now it's pretty basic. We're essentially asking if they found the call to be helpful and if they were satisfied with the assistance they received from the social workers. And the vast majority of people that have responded to the survey so far have said they were satisfied or very satisfied, and they found it helpful or very helpful to have the contact from the social workers. And then we get some open-ended comments just about how they were so surprised that this resource existed with the medical examiner's office. They really didn't even know they needed the outreach until they heard from one of the social workers. So we're getting very positive feedback on just how helpful it is to have these contacts made, even if they didn't necessarily know they needed it. So just wanted to give a little bit of context there before Victoria goes on.
Absolutely. One other thing I wanted to add when Connie was talking, I forgot to mention, sometimes because we get the information right on the spot for individuals who may have passed away from a probable overdose, that doesn't mean we get all of them. There are many times where we will find out later. So we monitor the daily number of individuals who have been identified as a probable overdose, but we may find out later that they did a toxicology, and it may be a couple months down the road, and this person also died from some type of substance involved death. So that also adjusted a little bit. So if we identified, let's say 30 for the month, but 2 months down the road, it turns out there were 40. We have to play a little bit of catch up. So we may be a little bit behind on making that 6 to 8 week contact. We're actually making the contact with these individuals well beyond that because we didn't find out for a few months. So that does happen. All right. As far as the referrals to community-based agencies, which I kind of talked about a little bit before, we met with a number of agencies within Milwaukee County to identify appropriate referrals and tried to figure out what information was needed. Because what we want to do is make servicing more accessible. And sometimes people in the midst of their grief or their what they've heard through third parties is that, oh, it's not easy to get these resources. So we met with a lot of agencies, found out what does it take, what do we need, and see if we can get someone to agree to take referrals directly from us, um, or just to give us the information we need so we can make it easier for the families to understand. So we will make referrals not just for the identified primary next of kin, but if it's a girlfriend, a friend, anyone who's in need, because the whole goal is in a postvention type context to help prevent more people from suffering from some type of substance involved death, which I'll explain that language a little later. Um, these resources have been very open to it. There are some that are like, yeah, okay. Most of them are very open to it. They want to have better accessibility to their services, so they're very open to talking to us about that. Um, we continue to add referral options as we identify them. Um, Based on the need, because as many of you know, that can go up and down. 1 minute, the need is everybody needs, I don't know, bus tickets or transportation needs. The next minute, it may be more education on Narcan. We are very consistent with Narcan education, but we try and make sure we're trying to access these things on a regular basis so that families know where to go and we can get them that servicing. So we did create a referral form in RedCap that we send to these organizations. And as I mentioned above, previously, 61% of our referrals through March of this year go to individual counseling. The next is the mobile overdose response initiatives, or MORI as we called it. So that's the firefighters integrated health team. Then our West Allis Village also has one. There are a couple other ones. And then there's Kids Matter where we get guardianship assistance. When I first started, the thought was, oh, there's so many children, and they're in the home and they're viewing their loved ones dying from some type of loss. What I found from 2020 on was until maybe about a year ago, not many kids are in the home when someone is passing away. So that assumption wasn't actually correct. But that doesn't mean people don't need resources. So there are times when we'll call a relative or a next of kin, and they said, "Yeah, my cousin has the decedent's children, and can you call them and help them with some services?" And we'll do that.
And we probably should clarify that these are the ones where we're making direct referrals, but the social workers also provide other types of resources to individuals based on their needs. And we'll also tell you about some things that we tried that didn't work quite as well. We've tried lots of
Yes.
different things. So.
Oh yeah, we're always trying something to try and improve the service offerings. As far as grief resources, the list of grief resources, let's see, we're using a lot of the GRASP chapters. For those who are not aware, Angie was one of the ones who reached out to GRASP and got us some information on them, but they provide free of charge national support for individuals who've experienced some type of loss due to an overdose. So we connect a lot of people to those resources because it's free of charge. They can go, usually it's once per week depending on which chapter you're talking about. And it's run by a number of volunteers. So that's one of the ones. It's also one of the national ones that we'll have on our list for people we do not contact. As I mentioned, the Office of Community Wellness and Safety grant, that's where we send for the individual therapy. And they're usually able to get people into therapy within a month. or less. So that's why we use that, and they'll offer 6 free sessions for people who need individual therapy resources. Though, what is grief handout? Because a lot of people don't know what it is. We'll talk to them and they said, I'm good. I went back to work. I drank a little bit and I'm fine. And they don't recognize that they're showing signs of really being impacted by grief. So we thought that was very helpful to have that handout. And we worked specifically with one of the psychologists through the medical college to help us curate that flyer and make sure it had the information necessary so that people can, if they're seeing signs of it in themselves or in children, because a lot of times if kids are playing, people think they're not upset. Then you know what you're seeing and you know what you're dealing with. The out of county letters, we're trying to make sure that they have our contact information, they have these national resources, and also that they know they can still reach out to us. Even if we are not in their particular state or county, they can always call us to talk about their needs, whether it's Narcan training, whether they want to understand the cause of death a little bit better. We make that available. And then we also set up very early on in this process a post-vention monthly collaboration where we work with the individuals from the Office of Community Wellness and Safety. We also have a different division within MCW that handles suicide losses. And we talk with them so that we can talk about what's working, what's not working, what resources are available, and also decompress because that's part of that self-care that is very helpful. So, lessons learned. Families generally aren't ready to talk about grief until they're ready. They want to know what that cause of death is. We cannot try and force them to talk about themselves when they're worried about what really happened to their loved one. Families are typically grateful. I usually get a lot of feedback from families about, I didn't know this existed. Connie mentioned that earlier. I'm really happy that you're calling me. Even if they don't want resources, they typically are pretty happy to hear from us. I've had one or two. It was like, well, why are you calling? And it's weird to them. Other ones where they're very happy. Unfortunately, I've also had people who've had multiple deaths and they remember me. So they'll say, oh, Victoria, I remember you called me last year when this individual died, and now I'm responsible for this other one. Thank you for always checking in on me. Um, and then they're not, one of the things that we have said many, many times, families don't like the word overdose. That was the first thing we learned. We do not use that language in our letters, and we don't use the language in our calls. Overdose has a connotation to some family members that usually equates to something um, very negative to them. Some have said, oh, no, you're calling my loved one a crackhead. They weren't a crackhead. This was a one time thing. Or no, they weren't an addict. That's not what it is. They do respond very well to substance involved death, though. So we try and use that language whenever we're talking to next of kin, regardless of their level of understanding about substance use. We always use that language. All right. The number of families where children live in the home is less than expected. As I noted, there are times when we'll have a small jump in the number of children that are in the homes, but most of the time they're not there. And then additionally on that, the medical examiner's office has been very clear that unless a child is the subject of that loss, that they will not compile that information. So they may mention that there was a minor child in the home, but 90% of the time they will not get the name. They won't even tell us where the child went because that is not their responsibility. They let the police department and EMS handle it. So if there's a mention that there was somebody underage, which they'll say there was a minor child in the home, many times we are contacting the family to find out more specific details about that. Because what we learned about coroner's offices and medical examiner's offices is that many of their records are public. So if the local TV station wants to run a report on this death, if a child's name is in there, they feel that's inappropriate. That's why they will not put the names in there. So they're very specific about that. We also learned that the number of available grief support groups changed with the pandemic, and the number of Spanish-speaking resources and therapists are very, very limited. That's one of the reasons why Sulema was brought on, because we definitely needed someone who spoke Spanish for a number of these families, because we do have a high occurrence rate with Spanish-speaking individuals. The other thing we learned about grief groups, which Connie kind of alluded to, we started one last year. Unfortunately, this is one of those ebb and flow times in life where people aren't open to grief group. I've always experienced more people being individually therapy focused, but for groups, although we think it's a good idea, a lot of people have given the feedback they don't really want to sit in a group and talk about their loss with other people who are struggling just as hard as them. So right now, we're not having a great deal of success with getting people to do that. So let's talk about the next of kin interviewing a little bit. We started next of kin interviews in the fall of 2021. We worked on developing our protocol. We put a separate area in a report area in RedCap so that we could have this information, and we developed our materials, protocol, and everything else related to that. By May of 2022, we participated in the COSUP next of kin interview training. And by May, also within that month, we started the interview process. Case selection. So when we first started, we were looking at things where we would do a random selection, and it was every, I think, 8 months. We would go 8 months out. So we were trying to avoid birthdays, holidays, the anniversary of the loss, as a means of trying to get people to participate in interviewing. Now we've changed it to more of a thematic type of review. So we plan for a 4-month theme, 3 months prior. So I believe one of the things we had in the past was, because we saw a high occurrence rate of it, 50-year-old African American males. So we will still do a random selection, find a number of individuals who may have died within that range, and then we try and get some next of kin interviews based on that theme. The death cases that were within they have to be aligned with that theme. So that's one of the things that we do. And we usually pull about 20 to 24 cases, which at the time, because Sulema is newer, that usually equates to about 12 people that we reach out to during that 4-month period. Once we get to that 4-month period, we will reach out to about 12 people. And typically we get about a third of those people. So 3 to 4 interviews are usually successful, and that's how we're able to get those numbers. So we have a good number of people. We will send out a letter asking people to participate in these interviews. I'll be honest with you, people don't read the letters. They don't. We'll send them out and we'll say, hey, we would love to talk to you. They do not read those letters. Every time I call someone, they're like, no, I didn't read it. I saw it, but I didn't read it. So we end up explaining that via the phone call. We wait approximately a week to 2 weeks before we attempt that first phone call. And because we've been doing bereavement support with them previously, it is more successful because they'll remember the voice. They'll remember that they talked to us. But when we first started, we hadn't done bereavement support with a number of those people, and we still got a really good response rate. It's just one of the things that we learned was, again, making sure we weren't hitting anniversaries, holidays, any of that, and we try and avoid that. We also screen out anything that may still be an open criminal investigation or anything of that sort. We can go to the next one. So our metrics for the case reviews, we've randomly selected 215 cases. We've had about 50 interviews conducted, 30 declined. 135 cases did not respond to the letter plus 2 phone calls, because we make 2 phone calls for those. And I think I knew I forgot to mention something for bereavement support calls. We make 3 attempts. Connie had mentioned that earlier, and I forgot to say that. But for next of kin interviewing, we only make 2 attempted phone calls. The data that we collect during those next of kin interviews, anything about childhood events, adulthood, anything related to their mental health, their substance use history, and most importantly, family recommendations to prevent another loss.
And I'll just jump in here for a second. So one of the things that I think is really important to understand is that, so as Victoria said, the initial calls are 6 to 8 weeks after the loss occurred. And then we wait obviously a longer period. So we go back a bit further for the cases that we identify as potential for the next of kin interview based on the theme that we are doing for that 4-month cycle. And then the letters go out. We hope people read the letters, but often they don't. But it's kind of our way of giving people a heads up that they might be hearing from us. But then it's very intentional that whoever did the original grief or bereavement call is the one that calls for the next of kin interview. So that, I think, is part of our success in terms of, and that's part of why we wanted to give you the background on how our overall process works, because this is never a cold call that has had no contact at all with one of the social workers, but it's the particular social worker who had contact with the individual who does the follow-up. So there's already, some rapport that's been built, and I think that's an important part of both the ability to make that contact, but also just feeling okay about the fact that we are asking them to share so much detailed information about the life and experience of their loved ones, because these interviews they're pretty intense. And we're going to talk a little bit about the format that we use. And we have there's a couple different formats out there, but I do think the approach of having kind of this secondary follow-up and not having it feel like a cold call is part of what we are doing.
Just quickly to answer one of the questions, yes, you are able to get some of the interview tools. So as I stated, some of the other lessons learned, we modified the language. So no use of the word overdose unless we're asking, so one of the questions in the tool is, did your loved one experience an overdose, which would have, of course, been non-fatal within a certain time period. Usually, I think it's the last year. But we use substance-involved death for the rest of it. We identified a need. At the end of each and every one of these interviews, we do a thank you note. And specifically, some of the feedback we received, actually, I believe it was Angie that received that feedback, was some families are not comfortable with getting in a thank you note without permission. So we ask ahead of time, is it okay if I send you one? And one of the reasons for that was sometimes family doesn't always want to talk about this stuff. And that I want to say this very clearly. Calling any family member and saying, will you tell us about your loved one's substance use? You're going to get a no for that. Absolutely don't ask them that. They don't want to talk about it in that context. When I call, as Angie calls it, it's a conversation. We want to look at trying to improve servicing within the community. And we want to learn about that by talking about your loved one. It is a little bit of a finesse, but when you call and say, hey, talk to us about the drug usage that your loved one had, most of them are not interested. That doesn't go over well at all. That's where I got the majority of my no's. And as Angie has many times said, these are conversations. So reading down the list of questions doesn't work. Many times I will start off by asking, hey, I think the first question is, how much contact did you have with your loved one within the last year? And they will say, oh, yeah, and they'll start talking about things, and I'll let them go. I'll insert little questions here and there to make sure I can fill out the other sections, but I want them to feel comfortable talking about things. So you don't ask these questions in a linear way. It doesn't go over well. We also observe that different family members may have different levels of reception to doing an interview. Very specifically, my personal experience, if you have someone who identifies as transgender, um, typically their siblings are more open than the parents. It it just happens that way a lot. They're actually typically more accepting. So if you have a transgender individual, absolutely don't use their dead name. If I know the medical examiner's office or coroner's office in your area may have that the guy's name was John Smith, but they identified as Sarah. Absolutely use the name Sarah. Don't use John. Because that's seen as disrespectful to many, even though the decedent is deceased. So we want to make sure we're accounting for that. I also ask families at the beginning of the interview, do they want me to use their first name? Sometimes they're like, no, their name was Jonathan, but we call him John. So can you use John throughout the interview? And I use whatever is most comfortable for the families, so that they can feel like they're having that conversation, as Angie was saying. We provide the option for individuals to complete the interview via a survey on their own, so they don't have to talk to us about it. We've had a couple people start those. We haven't had very many people finish them. Um, I think maybe we'll look at that a little bit, and see what more we can do. But for the most part, most people that we've had the most success are doing that via phone call from us. Um, So the receptivity of the interview is very much related to families being accepting of the cause of death. If they're still at a place, even 8 months or 9 months out, where they're not necessarily, well, I don't think they were using. I think this was a homicide, or my loved one never used drugs before. They're not going to agree to an interview. Um, we find that quite a bit. It takes a lot of strength for any loved one, um, to do any kind of interview where they talk about this stuff, because we're asking them a lot of detail. So we're always very thankful and grateful for those that are participating in these interviews. I have noted that most families don't really have a very solid understanding of what treatment looks like. Um, some of the feedback that we receive is, oh, well, they went to detox, and so they should have been good, or they went from detox to sober living, or we sent them straight to sober living. That type of feedback we receive quite a bit, because most families do not understand how that works and what substance use disorder looks like. They know what they've seen, but they don't know what the treatment looks like. Is that it? Okay.
That's it's for the slides, but then I think we did want to take a minute to show you, just moving from one thing on my screen to another here.
Okay, while you do that,
Yep.
I do have a couple other lessons learned, and I wanted to open it up for Angie and Sulema if
Yep.
either one has anything. Um, the other thing is scheduling of next of kin interviews doesn't work. Most of our success has come from asking them, are they available right in that moment? And we let them know that it takes as long as they have the time to commit to it. So some interviews are 45 minutes, some of them can be 2 hours. It really depends on the individual. We try not to schedule anything after those, give ourselves a little bit of a break so that we have a little time to decompress from it, because it is a lot of information and you're not sure what kind of information you're going to receive. I'll stop rambling just to see if Angie wanted to add anything.
Sure. Yes. Thank you, Victoria. I
Mhm.
will. Um, as Victoria mentioned, and Connie and Victoria both did a great job presenting what we really do and how it normally works for us with the interviews. But I would just, my recommendations or suggestion would be just always lead your conversations with compassion and empathy, and also remembering that these conversations with the families, the next of kin, they're all voluntary. So I always say to them, thank you for speaking with me about your loved one's life, but some questions could be triggering, and
Mhm.
so letting them know that we can stop, we can take a break at any moment. We can stop, even if we have to end it, which of course we want to get all the information, but it's most important that they take care of themselves throughout this whole conversation. So, and also just being mindful, they may not tell you that they're triggered by any questions, but if you see that they're tearing up, they're very emotional, then you can suggest to them, do we want to take a break? Do we want to stop? So I would say that for sure. And then also remembering a lot of you are starting this this process is new. So as Victoria mentioned, we've made some changes like the language of from overdose to substance involved death, to not just assuming everyone wants a thank you card. So be mindful that this is forever evolving. What we started off doing in 2020 with the protocol and processes changed to where we're at right now. So just take in mind when families give you a suggestion as to what they think will be best or most helpful in these conversations, to just tweak your protocol and your process to fit the needs of the families.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
yeah. So I think that's mainly it. And then the last but very not least is self-care, which Victoria mentioned is very, very important for self-care, because these conversations could take 30 minutes, an hour, hour and a half, depending if you have to stop, take a break. And it's not just difficult for them, but it's difficult for us, because it's a lot of information, and it's hard information that we're working with. So be mindful that you go take a, for me, like Victoria loves her music, I love my hot baths and my candles. So whatever you feel like, or go for a walk right afterwards. I like to take walks, especially in Wisconsin, and I'm sure in Illinois, depending how far we go in Illinois. If you go further like Kentucky, then it's a little warmer. But take breaks and go for a walk and decompress, so that you can, just reflect on what all happens. Because what I do when we do the interview, they've all mostly been over the phone. I'm typing as they speak, but then
Mhm.
after the conversation is over, it might be an hour, hour and a half. Then I have to go in and clean up my notes, because I'm typing fast, making a lot of errors. So that takes another, I don't know, 30, 40 minutes to really type it up the way you want it to be in red cap. So those would probably be my tips for you. And if I think of any other, I'll let you know. But those are the most important.
Based on what Angie just said, one other thing I was just thinking about is we also offer resources at the end of the interviews. So if someone is really struggled through the interview and maybe they want more information, that's actually a specific question at the bottom where we ask, do you want other resources? Do you want more Narcan? Education? Do you know of anyone who's struggling right now that may need resources? I've made referrals for individual therapy or group therapy after the next of kin interviews. We definitely do that.
Right. And Victoria's right. Just even if you've spoken with that person before, they might not have been receptive for those resources at the moment, and then they might want it afterwards. So Victoria's actually absolutely right what she mentioned.
And I know there was already a question in the chat about receiving copies. We'll absolutely share. Happy to share the slides and happy to share the documents that we use. So we essentially have a protocol that Victoria mentioned earlier, just outlining what this process is all about. But then in REDCap, we essentially have two parts. The first is talking through making sure the person is consenting, right? Making sure that they actually are agreeing to participate in the interview. And then what's a little bit different, I think, about the way our interviews are structured is it is definitely much more of a conversation. So you'll see, other examples where there's lots of close-ended questions and, lots of how many times did this happen in the last X amount of months or period of time. Ours is much more about let's talk a little bit and get to know the person you're talking to, as well as things about their loved one, but all in that context of, as Victoria said, we're reaching out to you to learn more about what happened with your loved one so that we can make system and process improvements to hopefully save lives in the future and save other families from the same tragedy that this individual has experienced. So I don't think it's as linear, I think, and Angie and Victoria jump in because you're the ones that do this, but it was really intentional to have this be more conversational. We definitely have areas that we try to get to, like experiences in their childhood, things about their life as an adult, what their support network looked like, all of that. But it's much more, as you see, a lot of open-ended questions. So as Angie was saying, they're taking notes as they go, but then sometimes it's also going back and kind of reflecting and putting that into more of a package so that it can be used to help inform our review process. And that's essentially how it gets integrated as part of our case review process.
Right. And some of that information, as I think Victoria and Connie both stated, when you just let them, if they decide that they just want to speak about their loved ones and, get the information as they're speaking, you don't have to go from question to question. You get some of that information just as they're talking about the life of their loved one.
Absolutely. So I wanted to address a few questions, which will fit into some of the things that have been talked about here. So let's see. The first part of it is, would love to hear other thoughts on how to be trauma informed and healing centered. So I think if unfortunately COSAP doesn't offer the training on next of kin interviewing that they previously did, but I think it's very valuable for any program to maybe do a motivational interviewing training. That would be very helpful. Um, I every Each one of us is a social worker. We're all licensed social workers. I think there's value and I specifically have a trauma informed care certification, and I'm also dark and twisty. We could talk about that later. I do a lot of other goofy things in my life, which yeah, we'll talk about that later. But one of the things very specifically we try and do is that empathetic tone. You cannot sound like you're interviewing them. And that's why the language that Angie uses about this being a conversation is very important. The training, the conference I went to a few years ago, I know there was a lot of talk back then about using retired police officers. I will say this in the nicest way that I can. Absolutely not. Never. Don't do it. That's not a thing. Honestly, I think anybody doing next of kin interviewing should have previous experience um, doing a family assessment. That doesn't have to be a social worker. It can be a case manager in social services, but not anybody who is a researcher or a ex-police officer, firefighter. I think they need to have that experience because you learn through that process how to gather information, how to allow the family or next of kin to lead. That is very important. If you don't have that, people are less receptive. They're just not going to respond well to that. Um, so I know it was a big thing to, oh, let's do that. No police officers, please. I mean, I've had during a next of kin interview, a next of kin identified that they bought $25,000 worth of marijuana and other drugs with their loved one, and they smoked this like a couple years before this person's death, and they have they had a history of being a drug dealer. We don't want a ex police officer or someone who has a different role in society or doesn't have experience to not know how to handle that kind of information. Um, so that's something that I would directly recommend against in that way. Um, we've never used peer support specialists, individuals with lived experience to provide these interviews. I think if that is something that you guys are interested in doing, that's great, but I think they need a level of training in this stuff. It's not enough just to have the lived experience. To collect information, you really need someone who may not be triggered by listening to all this information about substance use, and they also have the as I said, they need to know how to do an assessment. We are also doing mental health status exams as we're doing this. And what a mental health status exam is where we're assessing for whether someone is suicidal, homicidal, or otherwise during these conversations. So if you don't know what to do in that moment, then they need specific training in that, because we have had people express they don't want to live as they're talking about the death of their loved one. So that's another level of education they'll need. I think anybody who's doing it, you want to make sure they're doing enough training so that they can be prepared, because it's heavy. It's very, very heavy work. And if you're not used to it, it can wear you down. Unfortunately, we have experienced in Milwaukee County having some peer support specialists who did not deal with the heaviness of this work very well, and unfortunately relapsed into substance use. So we don't want to do that. We want someone who's able to handle that through all the training that they got. They're going to need that support. So I think, let me see, did I miss anything?
I think I answered.
Yep, I
I
see you
answered the
answered
other
it.
ones. And just, I know we're running short on time,
Yes,
but
sorry.
we will package up materials and we'll send them so that they can be shared with everyone. But then happy to answer follow-up questions. So if it would be helpful to have a follow-up discussion, or if you want to email us questions, our email and everything, our emails will all be in the presentation, and feel free to reach out to us with other questions. So happy to support in lessons that we've learned along the way, so you don't have to go through some of the same challenges that we did as you're getting your process started.
Absolutely. Thank you for everyone's time.
I want to say thank you so much for the wonderful conversation. This has been incredibly informative. I did have one quick question. Hopefully it's fairly quick, I hope. But for counties that have more limited capacity and may not have a dedicated social worker on staff, what is your advice towards, conducting an next of kin interview, giving those grief resources out with that limited staff capacity?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have limits in that way. And I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to build some information as far as finding resources in the community. Look for the national resources like GRASP if you don't have anything in your area. But I would say there are a number of online trainings for if you have someone who's doing it, maybe they're just purely a researcher, nothing wrong with that, but you do need to provide additional training for them because it can be heavy work and it doesn't look the same as regular research work. It's a little different. Angie, did you have something, or Sulema?
No, I was just going to mention that, like you said, the trainings, Victoria and I both found some great trainings through, trying to think of the name of the company. I think it was Pepsi or something like that.
Pepsi.
I can get it to you, and it was free. Or no, wait, if you wanted the educational hours, I think they charged us for that. But if you didn't want educational hours, then it was free. So there are a lot of educational trainings for free out there, or for maybe limited amount of funding or charging you to actually participate. So you might want to do that kind of research as well, just to get additional training.
Yeah, and we certainly have small counties. We do the OFR training and technical assistance for all of the OFR counties across Wisconsin, and we certainly have small counties. And so actually part of what we're doing is some next of kin interview training for those local teams. So that's something that we'd be happy to share as we get that rolled out. And as Angie and Victoria said, I think part of it is getting people additional just experience with this type of interviewing, but also make sure they know some options on what to do if they are concerned about someone when they're speaking with them. So even if they're not from their own background able to maybe handle it the way Angie and Victoria and Zulema might, that they know, oh, this is who I should reach out to, or these are some steps that I can take. Maybe you have a mobile integrated health unit at your fire department that could do some follow-up, or you've got another resource that you could point them to. So just making sure that they feel well equipped to respond in the moment as well, I think is important.
Some great tips. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're very welcome.
I
Thanks
deeply
for having us.
Great to see
We
you guys.
appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Bye
And
bye.
thank you everybody who joined us today. I know it's a little past the hour, so I'll let everyone go, but thank you so much.
No, thank you.
All righty. Bye bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.